They called him the Wolf of Blackthorne. 12 border lords knelt before his shadow. 6 trade routes bled gold into his vaults every season. 3 armies marched under his black banner without question. And on the night the first winter snow buried Ravenmere Castle in silence, Duke Cassian Veyne stood at the highest window of his empire and believed, with the certainty of a man who had never been denied, that he owned everything worth owning. He was wrong, because the one thing he never learned to hold was already walking out the door. Stay until the last word. This one earns its scars. The fire in the West Tower's study cracked and hissed against birch logs that had been split that morning by hands Cassian would never see. He stood with his back to the flames, reading a dispatch from the southern garrison, and the orange light carved his profile into something monumental. Tall, broad through the chest, a jaw built for command and a mouth that rarely softened unless he wanted something from someone who could not refuse him. At 41, Duke Cassian Veyne carried the kind of authority that did not announce itself because it did not need to. When he entered a room, silence arrived first. When he spoke, men revised their positions mid-sentence. And when he was displeased, entire households recalibrated their breathing. He set the dispatch down on the mahogany desk and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. The southern garrison commander wanted reinforcements. The mountain passes near Greycliff had seen irregular movement. Smugglers, probably. Or scouts from Lord Heron Drace, whose territorial ambitions had been growing louder in council for months. Either way, it required attention he did not want to give tonight. Tonight was supposed to be simple. "You look like a man carrying a war he hasn't started yet," said Aldrich Morn from the doorway. Cassian did not turn. "I look like a man who hasn't eaten since noon because his steward forgot the evening tray." "Your steward didn't forget. Your steward was reassigned to inventory duty after you threw a candlestick at the wall yesterday." "I threw it at the map. The map was on the wall." Aldrich stepped inside without waiting for permission, which was a privilege exactly 3 people in the Dominion possessed. As Cassian's chief counsel and oldest surviving friend, Aldrich had earned the right to be irritating at inconvenient hours. He was a lean man in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and now settled into something more useful, sharp, watchful. Tired in the way that people who serve powerful men eventually become tired, not from labor, but from the relentless task of translating fury into policy. "The Southern Dispatch," Cassian said. "I read it. And Heron Drace is probing. He won't commit troops until spring, but he wants you to overextend before the frost breaks." Cassian turned from the window. The firelight caught the scar that ran along his left temple, a souvenir from a border skirmish 12 years ago that he wore like a signature. "Then we let him probe. Pull the garrison back to the river crossing and fortify Ashenmere instead. If Drace wants the mountain passes, let him freeze in them." Aldrich nodded slowly, not because he agreed, but because he was calculating how many lords would interpret a tactical withdrawal as weakness. That was the mathematics of power in Blackthorne Dominion. Every move was a message. Every absence was an invitation. And Cassian, for all his strategic brilliance, had developed the dangerous habit of believing his reputation alone could hold the borders. "There's something else," Aldrich said. "There's always something else. The succession documents. Your solicitor delivered the revised draft this afternoon. It requires your seal before the winter assembly." Something shifted behind Cassian's eyes. A flicker. Not guilt exactly. More like the shadow of a door he preferred to keep locked. "I'll review it tomorrow." "You said that last week." "Then I'll say it again next week, and the pattern will hold." Aldrich studied him for a long moment. There were things he knew about Cassian that no lord or general or diplomat would ever see. He had watched this man build an empire from fractured alliances and inherited debt. He had stood beside him when the old duke's creditors came calling, and Cassian, barely 23, had negotiated terms so brutal that 2 merchant houses dissolved within the year. He had seen the ruthlessness that others called genius and he called survival. But he had also watched, over the past 18 months, something corrosive settle into the architecture of Cassian's decisions. A recklessness dressed as confidence. A pattern of private choices that endangered public stability. He knew about Seraphine. Everyone who mattered knew about Seraphine. The only person who seemed not to know, or at least performed the appearance of not knowing, was Lyra. "Your wife asked about the household ledgers today," Aldrich said carefully. Cassian's expression sealed itself shut. "Lyra always asks about the household ledgers. She finds comfort in numbers. She finds answers in numbers. There's a difference." "Is there a point buried somewhere in this conversation, Aldrich? Or are you just circling the fire because you enjoy the warmth?" "The point is that your wife is not stupid, Cassian. She has never been stupid. And the longer you treat her silence as ignorance, the more dangerous that silence becomes." Cassian's jaw tightened. He crossed to the desk and poured himself a measure of whiskey from a crystal decanter that had belonged to his father. The amber liquid caught the firelight and held it like a small trapped sun. He drank it in one motion, not for pleasure, but for the familiar burn that replaced thought with sensation. "Lyra is fine," he said. Aldrich let the lie stand. Some walls were too thick to breach with words. He had learned that about Cassian long ago. The man could see the interior workings of every political machine in the Dominion, but remained profoundly blind to the machinery of his own household. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because looking inward required a kind of courage that conquering outward never demanded. "I'll draft the garrison orders tonight," Aldrich said, and left the room the way he had entered. Quietly, with the weight of things unsaid pressing down on his shoulders like fresh snow. The east wing of Ravenmere Castle existed in a different register of silence than the rest of the fortress. Where the west tower hummed with political energy, dispatches, couriers, the constant low-frequency vibration of empire management, the east wing held a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the stones themselves had learned to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Duchess Lyra Veyne sat at her writing desk in the private chamber overlooking the frozen gardens, and she was not doing what anyone expected her to be doing. She was not embroidering. She was not reviewing menus. She was not composing the kind of gracious correspondence that duchesses were trained to produce like elegant machines. She was reading a document that she had removed from her husband's locked study drawer 3 hours ago, using a key that he did not know she possessed. At 36, Lyra carried the particular beauty of a woman who had been underestimated so consistently that it had become a form of camouflage. Dark hair pulled back from a face that balanced warmth with precision, hands that knew how to arrange flowers, and how to read financial contracts with equal fluency. Eyes the color of winter oak, and right now those eyes were perfectly still, moving line by line through language that was designed to erase her from the future of everything she had built. The document was Cassian's revised last will and testament. She read it the way she read everything, slowly, completely, without the luxury of denial. The will named Lady Seraphine Vale as primary beneficiary of the Blackthorne estate in the event of Cassian's death. It established a trust for Seraphine's unborn child with full succession rights to the duchy. It reduced Lyra's inheritance to a modest country house in the northern holdings and an annual stipend that would not have covered the candle budget of Ravenmere for a single season. Lyra set the document down on the desk. She did not cry. She had spent the tears for Cassian years ago, in the early seasons of their marriage, when she still believed that devotion could be converted into reciprocity if only she poured enough of herself into the exchange. She had loved him with the kind of thoroughness that borders on self-destruction. She had reorganized his failing estate finances. She had brokered the trade alliance with the coastal merchants that tripled Ravenmere's revenue. She had hosted the diplomatic gatherings that transformed Cassian from a regional lord into a dominion-wide power. And she had done all of it quietly, invisibly, the way load-bearing walls do their work. No one admires a foundation, they admire the tower. Now the tower was being given to someone else. She stood and moved to the window. Below, the castle grounds lay buried under snow that looked clean and absolute in the moonlight, a world made simple by winter. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and felt the temperature differential between her body and the night. That was the gap. That was always the gap. The distance between what she gave and what she received, between what she knew and what she was permitted to know, between the woman she actually was and the decorative silence they all mistook for compliance. 14 years, she said to no one. 14 years of marriage. 14 years of building something she believed was shared, and the proof that it was never shared sat on her desk in legal language so precise it could cut bone. She had known about Seraphine for 11 months. Not through gossip, which was the currency lesser wives traded in, but through the financial records. Cassian had been diverting funds to a private account at a merchant bank in Ashenmere. The amounts were small at first, easily hidden in the operational noise of a large estate. But Lyra understood numbers the way Cassian understood warfare, instinctively, structurally, and the pattern had revealed itself like a bruise darkening under skin. By the time she confirmed the affair through other means, a maid's overheard conversation, a perfume that did not belong to any woman in the household, she had already mapped its financial footprint with the precision of a forensic accountant. But the will was something else entirely. The will was not passion. The will was architecture. It was Cassian deliberately constructing a future in which she did not exist, not killed, not divorced, simply subtracted, reduced to an inconvenience that could be relocated to a distant property and forgotten. Lyra turned from the window and began to dress, not in the silk sleeping gowns that lined her wardrobe, in riding clothes, practical wool, thick boots that she had not worn since the autumn inspection tours. She moved through the room with a controlled urgency that looked nothing like panic and everything like planning. She packed one saddlebag with essentials, documents, a small leather case of personal items, a sealed envelope containing copies of financial records she had been quietly assembling for months. She paused at the writing desk and considered leaving a letter. The impulse lasted 3 seconds. A letter was a gift to the person you were leaving. It provided explanation, comfort, closure. She was not interested in giving Cassian any of those things. Let the absence speak. Let the silence do the work she had been doing for 14 years. Let him feel, for the first time in his carefully controlled life, the weight of a void he could not fill with command or conquest. She took the will with her. By the time the night guard completed his rotation past the east wing at 3:30, the Duchess's chambers were dark. By the time the kitchen staff began the morning fires at 5, the stables reported a horse missing. By the time Aldrich Morn knocked on Cassian's study door at 7, with the garrison orders ready for signature, the most important person in Ravenmere Castle had been gone for nearly 4 hours, riding northwest through snow that covered her tracks as fast as she made them. The morning unraveled in stages. First came the confusion, a maid reporting an empty bed, cold sheets, the Duchess's riding cloak absent from its hook. Then the irritation, Cassian assuming Lyra had taken an early ride, something she occasionally did when the household pressure became suffocating. Then the concern, 3 hours, 4 hours, no sighting from the outer guards. Then the controlled fury that Cassian substituted for fear, because fear was an emotion he had trained himself to reject the way a body rejects infection. "Find her," he said to Aldrich. "I've sent riders to every road within. Find her." The repetition was not emphasis. It was the sound of a man who had built an entire identity around control, discovering that the foundation he stood on had vanished overnight. Cassian moved through the morning in a state of operational intensity that his officers recognized from wartime. He dispatched search parties in 4 directions. He summoned the night guards for interrogation. He ordered the stables inspected, the gates checked, the household staff questioned one by one in the great hall, while he stood at the head of the table and watched their faces the way a predator watches a herd for the weakest animal. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. Or more precisely, no one was willing to tell him anything, which was a distinction Cassian was too distracted to notice, but Aldrich absorbed immediately. "The staff is protecting her," Aldrich said quietly, pulling Cassian aside after the 5th interview produced nothing. "The staff serves me." "The staff is paid by you. They are loyal to her. There is a difference you have never cared to learn." Cassian stared at him with the kind of blank intensity that preceded either violence or revelation. On this morning, it produced neither. He turned away and moved to the window that overlooked the courtyard, where horses were being saddled and riders were pulling on heavy cloaks against the cold. The snow had stopped falling. The sky was the color of hammered tin, and somewhere in the vast white landscape beyond the castle walls, his wife was moving through territory that belonged to him in every legal sense and belonged to her in every way that mattered. "She took the will," Cassian said. The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Aldrich went motionless. "What will?" "The revised succession document. It was in my study drawer." The lock was opened with a key I did not authorize. What was in the will, Cassian? The silence that followed was the most honest thing Cassian had produced in months. It contained no deflection, no strategic framing, no political calculation. It was simply a man standing in the ruins of a decision he had believed he could make without consequence. Seraphine, he said. Aldrich closed his eyes, not in surprise, in the exhausted confirmation of something he had dreaded for months. How much? Everything. Define everything. The estate, the succession rights, a trust for the child. And Lyra? A house in the north. A stipend. A stipend. Aldrich repeated the word as if tasting something rotten. You gave a stipend to the woman who rebuilt your treasury from the ground up, who negotiated the coastal alliance that funds half your military operations, who managed every diplomatic function that turned you from a provincial lord into a power that border lords fear. A stipend. It was a legal precaution. A contingency in case what? In case you died and wanted your mistress to inherit the empire your wife constructed? That is not a contingency, Cassian. That is a confession. The temperature in the room dropped in ways that had nothing to do with winter. Cassian turned from the window and faced Aldrich with an expression that would have sent any other man in the Dominion backing toward the door. Be very careful. I have been very careful. For 18 months I have been very careful. I watched you conduct an affair with a woman whose ambition makes Heron Drace look like a modest farmer. I watched you divert household funds. I watched you rewrite legal documents that your wife built her life around. And I said nothing because I believed foolishly that you would come to your senses before the damage became structural. The damage is now structural. Lyra will come back. She's making a point. She is not making a point. She is executing a plan. And the fact that you cannot tell the difference is exactly why she left. The silence that followed lasted long enough for the fire to crack twice. Cassian stood very still, and for the first time in as long as Aldrich could remember, the Duke of Blackthorne looked like a man standing on ground that was no longer solid. News of the Duchess's disappearance spread through Ravenmere like fever through a barracks. By midday, the castle staff operated under a tension that turned every corridor into a holding pattern. By afternoon, the first whispers reached the merchant quarter. By evening, riders from 3 neighboring estates had arrived at the gates carrying politely worded inquiries that were actually intelligence-gathering operations. Lord Drace would know by tomorrow. The border lords by the end of the week. And once the political ecosystem of Blackthorne Dominion processed the information that Duke Cassian Veyne could not keep his own wife within his own walls, the calculations would begin. Every alliance built on the assumption of stability would be reevaluated. Every rival waiting for a sign of fracture would interpret this as permission. A duke who loses a battle can recover. A duke who loses control of his household invites questions that battles cannot answer. Seraphine arrived at Ravenmere that evening. She came by private carriage from her residence in Ashenmere, a manor house that Cassian had purchased for her 7 months ago under the name of a shell trading company. Lady Seraphine Vale, at 28, was the kind of beautiful that functions as a weapon. Golden-haired, sharp-featured, with a smile that could warm a room or cut a throat depending on what she needed from the person receiving it. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman who understood exactly what she offered and exactly what it was worth. She found Cassian in his study, standing over a map of the Dominion with search routes marked in red ink. "I came as soon as I heard," she said from the doorway. Cassian looked up. The exhaustion on his face rearranged itself into something softer when he saw her, and that rearrangement was perhaps the most damning evidence of everything Aldrich had tried to warn him about. The Duke of Blackthorne, who could face down hostile armies without flinching, could not maintain his defenses against a woman who had learned to enter rooms at precisely the right moment. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Not now. The household is panicking. Your wife is gone, and every lord in the Dominion is going to use this against you by week's end." She stepped inside and closed the door. "I should absolutely be here. If the staff sees you, the staff already knows, Cassian. Everyone already knows. Your wife knew. The only person maintaining the illusion of secrecy was you." She moved to the desk and studied the map with the practiced eye of someone who understood territorial strategy, not through military training, but through the more ancient discipline of social positioning. Seraphine came from a minor noble family whose wealth had evaporated 2 generations ago. What remained was the bloodline, the manners, and an intelligence that she had learned early to disguise as charm. She had survived court life by understanding a fundamental truth that most nobles never grasped. Power does not belong to those who hold titles. Power belongs to those who stand closest to those who hold titles. "She took the will," Cassian said. Seraphine's expression flickered. For exactly 1 second, the mask of composed concern slipped, and what appeared beneath it was something colder, sharper, and far more calculating than the face she presented to the world. Then the mask returned. "Which version?" "The revised version, the one that names you." "Then we need to move the timeline forward." "What timeline?" "The succession filing. If she presents that will to the council before you formally register the revision, it becomes a political weapon. She can claim coercion, manipulation. She can argue that the changes were made under your mistress's influence and demand annulment of the entire document." Cassian watched her, and something turned over in his chest that he could not name. Not suspicion exactly. More like the faint edge of a question he had never allowed himself to fully form. How quickly she pivoted from sympathy to strategy. How fluidly she processed a crisis that should have generated at least a moment of genuine concern for the missing woman. How naturally she translated his wife's disappearance into a succession opportunity. "Lyra is missing," he said slowly, "in winter, on horseback, alone." "Lyra is a grown woman who made a choice. You didn't drive her out. She left." "I'm not sure the distinction matters." "It matters legally, and right now legal is all that matters." He turned back to the map. The red lines of the search route spread outward from Ravenmere like arteries from a wounded heart. Somewhere along one of those lines, his wife was moving through frozen landscape with a document that could reshape the political future of the Dominion. And he was standing in a warm room with a woman who had already moved past the human dimension of the crisis and was operating entirely in the realm of strategic advantage. For the first time in 18 months, Cassian felt the full weight of the bargain he had made. Not the affair itself, which he had justified to himself through the usual architecture of rationalization, a cold marriage, a passionate alternative, the entitlement of powerful men to the appetites that sustain them, but the structural implications of choosing Seraphine. He had not simply taken a lover, he had installed a second operating system inside his empire, and that system was now running calculations that had nothing to do with his well-being and everything to do with its own survival. "Send more riders north," Seraphine said. "She'll head for the border. She has family connections in—" "She won't head for the border." "How do you know?" "Because Lyra doesn't run from things. She runs toward them. And if she left tonight with that document in these conditions, she's not fleeing, she's positioning." Seraphine studied his face. "Positioning for what?" Cassian did not answer because the truth forming in the back of his mind was too large and too dangerous to speak aloud. He had spent 14 years married to a woman whose competence he had relied upon and whose depth he had never measured. He had mistaken her patience for passivity, her silence for acceptance, her willingness to remain in the shadows for an inability to step into the light. And now, standing in his study with the map of his empire spread before him and his mistress calculating succession timelines beside him, Cassian Veyne began to understand something that would keep him awake for every night that followed. He had not lost a wife. He had lost an opponent he never knew he had. The snow began again at midnight. It fell over Ravenmere in thick curtains of white that erased the landscape and muffled the sounds of the search parties returning one by one to the castle gates, horses steaming, riders shaking their heads. Nothing. Every road checked, every village contacted, every inn and way station between Ravenmere and the northern border questioned. The Duchess of Blackthorne had vanished as completely as if the winter itself had swallowed her. Cassian stood at the window of his study long after the last rider reported. The fire had burned to embers. The whiskey decanter was empty. And in the drawer of his desk, in the space where the revised will had been, there was nothing but a single pressed flower, a winter rose, dried and brittle, the kind Lyra used to pick from the castle gardens during the first years of their marriage, when she still believed that small gestures could mean something to a man who measured the world in territories and leverage. He picked it up and held it in his palm. It weighed almost nothing. And yet, standing alone in the darkness of an empire he had built on the assumption that strength meant never needing what you could not control, Duke Cassian Veyne felt the weight of that dried flower like a verdict. Downstairs in the chamber that Seraphine had claimed for the night, despite every protocol of discretion, a letter was being written. Not to Cassian, not to any ally he would recognize. The letter was addressed to a name that appeared in no official registry of the Dominion, sealed with wax that bore no house insignia, and handed to a courier who left through the servants' gate before dawn. The courier rode south, toward Greycliff, toward Lord Drace, and the contents of that letter, if Cassian had read them, would have told him that his wife's disappearance was not the crisis he should have been worried about. The real crisis was already inside the walls. The courier reached Greycliff in 2 days. Lord Drace read the letter standing in the vaulted hall of his stone fortress, a structure built into the mountain itself like a fist driven into rock. He was a man of 53 whose body had been shaped by decades of borderland survival, thick through the neck and shoulders, skin weathered to leather, eyes set deep beneath a brow that seemed designed for calculation rather than expression. He read the letter twice. Then he burned it in the hearth fire, watched the wax seal bubble and blacken, and summoned his war marshal before the ash had finished cooling. The contents of that letter would remain unknown to Cassian Veyne for another 11 days. But their effect began moving through the political architecture of Blackthorne Dominion immediately, the way a crack moves through ice, invisible until the surface gives way. Back at Ravenmere, the third morning without the Duchess dawned gray and windless. Cassian had not slept. He stood in the council chamber at the head of a table designed to seat 24 lords and currently occupied by 6 of his most senior advisors, none of whom wanted to be in the room. The atmosphere carried the specific tension of men who understood that the crisis in front of them was not military, not territorial, not the kind of problem that could be solved by the mechanisms they had been trained to operate. This was domestic. And domestic crises in noble houses had a way of metastasizing into political ones with a speed that made battlefield reversals look sluggish. 3 days, Cassian said. 3 days and 60 riders, and not a single confirmed sighting. Aldrich sat at the far end of the table, watching. He had barely spoken since their confrontation in the study, and his silence functioned as its own form of commentary, a withdrawal of the council Cassian had come to depend on so completely that its absence felt like a missing limb. The snow covered her tracks within hours of departure, said Commander Voss, a broad-shouldered career soldier who ran Ravenmere's garrison with the mechanical efficiency of a man who preferred logistics to politics. Northwest roads are impassable past the Thornfield crossing. If she went that direction, she's either sheltering in a village or she didn't make it. The last 3 words hung in the room like smoke. She made it, Cassian said. My lord, the conditions, she made it. Lyra rides better than half my cavalry officers, and she knows this territory better than any of you. She planned this. She chose the timing. She chose the weather. She is not lost in a snowdrift. She is exactly where she intends to be. Voss glanced at Aldrich. Aldrich gave nothing back. The silence stretched until a younger advisor named Theron Blackwell cleared his throat in the way men do when they are about to say something they know will be unwelcome. My lord, the merchant guilds in Ashenmere have suspended 3 supply contracts pending, and I quote, clarification of household stability. Clarification of household stability. Their words, not mine. My household is stable. Your wife is missing, my lord. Cassian's hands went flat on the table. The gesture was small, but every man in the room registered it the way animals register a change in atmospheric pressure. Something shifting, something building. My wife is temporarily absent. That is not instability. That is a personal matter that has no bearing on trade agreements, military commitments, or the operational capacity of this dominion. With respect, Theron continued, and the word respect performed the same function it always performs in political language, serving as a polite container for something deeply disrespectful. The distinction between absence and instability is not ours to define. It belongs to the lords and merchants who depend on Ravenmere's consistency. Lord Fairholme has requested a personal audience. Lady Ashworth has recalled her trade envoy. And Lord Drace, what about Drace? His scouts have been seen moving closer to the Ashenmere corridor, not in force, but visible, deliberately visible. Cassian absorbed this the way he absorbed all threats, not with alarm but with the cold triage of a man who had learned early that panic was a luxury available only to those who could afford to lose. His father had taught him that, not through instruction but through example, through the spectacle of a duke who panicked at every setback and died drowning in debts he could have managed if he had held his nerve for 6 more months. Cassian had inherited that drowning empire at 23 and rebuilt it by understanding a single principle. The man who moves first controls the conversation. The man who reacts is already behind. But that principle assumed you could identify the threat. And the threat, sitting inside Ravenmere Castle, sleeping in a guest chamber 1 floor below his own study, writing letters he did not read to recipients he did not know, was one Cassian had not yet learned to see clearly. Seraphine found him after the council meeting. She was waiting in the corridor outside the chamber, which meant she had been listening, which meant she knew things about the council's deliberations that no one outside the room should possess. Cassian noted this and filed it in the same mental compartment where he stored inconvenient truths that he was not ready to process. "You need to address the succession question publicly," she said, falling into step beside him as he walked toward the West Tower. "Before the Winter Assembly, before Drace moves, before the merchants pull more contracts. The succession is not in question. It is in question the moment your wife vanishes with the document that defines it. Cassian, listen to me. The council sees a domestic crisis, the border lords see an opportunity, and every day you spend chasing Lyra through the snow is a day your enemies use to reposition." He stopped walking. The corridor was cold. Winter light came through the narrow windows in thin shafts that caught dust motes and made them look like frozen particles of time. "You want me to stop looking for her? I want you to stop making her disappearance the center of your political strategy. She left. She chose to leave. That is her decision, not your crisis. She left because of the will. She left because she is a woman who could not accept the reality of her situation. That is not your responsibility." Cassian studied Seraphine's face with an attention he had not applied before. Beautiful. Composed. Every feature arranged in an expression of concerned pragmatism. And beneath it, visible only if you knew where to look, the steady pulse of an agenda that had nothing to do with his well-being and everything to do with the outcome she had been engineering since the first night she appeared at a diplomatic reception 14 months ago, positioned precisely in his line of sight, wearing a gown the color of dark wine and a smile that promised the one thing his marriage had stopped providing. Not passion, attention. He had been a fool for attention. That was the architecture of it, not lust, although lust played its role the way percussion plays a role in an orchestra, present, driving, but not the melody. The melody was simpler and more devastating. Seraphine had seen him. Not the duke, not the strategist, not the inheritance or the title, or the territorial holdings, him. Or at least she had performed the act of seeing him so convincingly that the distinction between genuine attention and strategic performance had dissolved, and by the time it might have mattered, he was already inside a structure he did not build and could not see the walls of. "I'll address the succession after the search concludes," he said. "The search could take weeks." "Then it takes weeks." "You don't have weeks, Cassian." "I have exactly as long as I decide I have. That is the privilege of being the man whose name is on every document in this dominion." He walked away from her. It was the first time in their relationship that he had ended a conversation by leaving, and the small shock of it registered on Seraphine's face before she could compose it away. She stood in the cold corridor and watched him disappear around the corner, and something in her expression shifted from strategy to something harder, more cornered, the look of a woman who understood that the timeline she had been operating on was beginning to compress in ways she had not anticipated. Lyra had been riding for 4 days. She did not travel north, as Seraphine had predicted. She did not ride for the border, where family connections might have offered refuge. She went west, into the interior of the duchy, through the villages and market towns and agricultural districts that formed the actual foundation of Blackthorne's economy, the places that generated the wealth Cassian spent on armies and fortifications and the elaborate political machinery of dominion-wide power. She traveled under the name of a minor gentry widow, a woman of modest means visiting relatives. She wore plain clothes and rode a horse that was good, but not remarkable. And in every village she passed through, she stopped. She listened. She asked questions that sounded casual and were anything but. In Millhaven, a farming community 3 days west of Ravenmere, she sat in the common room of a roadside inn and listened to a grain merchant named Colum describe how the new tariff policies had doubled his transport costs. The Duke's trade office set the rates last summer, Colum said, pouring thin beer into clay cups that had seen better decades. He was a weathered man in his 60s whose hands were permanently shaped around the memory of burlap sacks and ledger books. They said it was temporary, to fund the garrison expansion in the south. Temporary. That was 8 months ago. And the impact? Half the independent farmers in this district can't afford to move their harvest to market, so they sell to the consolidators at a loss. And the consolidators are all connected to the same 3 merchant houses in Ashenmere. Same 3 houses that got the tariff exemptions. Lyra absorbed this. She had not designed those tariff policies. They had been implemented by Cassian's trade council during a period when she was managing a diplomatic crisis on the eastern border. And by the time she returned to review the domestic ledgers, the new rate structure was already embedded in the quarterly accounts as a fait accompli. She had flagged the irregularities to Aldrich. Aldrich had flagged them to Cassian. Cassian had dismissed the concern as minor operational friction, but it was not minor. Standing in the frozen mud of a village that should have been prosperous and was instead slowly suffocating under policies designed to concentrate wealth rather than distribute it, Lyra could see the damage with a clarity that distance from Ravenmere provided. The duchy was not failing from the outside. It was hollowing out from within. The border threats, the rival lords, the political maneuvering, these were symptoms. The disease was internal. A leadership structure so focused on external conquest and personal ambition that it had stopped listening to the territories it claimed to protect. She spent 3 more days moving through the western districts. In Thornfield, she found a magistrate who had been filing reports about bridge collapses on the main trade road for 2 years without receiving a response from Ravenmere. In Aldenmore, she met a physician who served 4 villages with supplies meant for one because the medical allocation had been redirected to fund a ceremonial expansion of the castle's south wing. In Brackenmire, she sat in a village council meeting and listened to elected representatives debate whether to send a formal petition to the Duke or simply accept that their concerns would never reach anyone with the authority to act on them. In every village, the pattern was identical. Resources flowing upward, information flowing upward, loyalty expected to flow upward, and nothing flowing back down. Lyra recorded everything: names, dates, amounts, policies. The financial architecture of neglect, documented with the same precision she had once applied to building Cassian's treasury. She was not gathering evidence for a court case. She was building something more dangerous, a complete picture of a duchy that looked powerful from above and was fracturing at every load-bearing joint beneath the surface. On the 7th night, in a farmhouse outside Thornfield, where she had been offered shelter by a widow named Marin, who asked no questions and expected no explanations, Lyra sat by a low fire and allowed herself to feel what she had been refusing to feel since the night she read the will. Not anger. Anger was fuel, and she needed it controlled, rationed, directed. What she felt was the specific grief of a woman who had spent 14 years loving a man who never understood that love was not a resource to be managed. It was not a variable in a political equation. It was not something you could draw from indefinitely while investing nothing in return. Cassian had treated her devotion like a natural feature of his landscape, permanent, self-sustaining, requiring no maintenance. The way you treat a river. You build your mill beside it and assume the water will always flow. But rivers change course. Rivers dry up. Rivers, when dammed long enough without release, find new channels and carve new paths through terrain that the people upstream never bothered to map. She was the river now, and Ravenmere was about to discover what it felt like when the current stopped arriving. Aldrich made his move on the 9th day. He did it carefully, the way you dismantle an explosive device with steady hands and the full awareness that one wrong cut would bring the whole structure down. He waited until Cassian was occupied with a garrison briefing, then walked to the east wing and entered Lyra's empty chambers for the first time since her departure. He He was not looking for clues about her location. He already had a reasonable guess about where she was headed and why. What he was looking for was evidence of something else entirely, something he had suspected for months but could not confirm without access to spaces that Lyra had kept carefully private. He found it in the false bottom of her writing desk. Copies. Dozens of them. Financial records, correspondence logs, transfer authorizations. A complete parallel archive of every significant transaction that had passed through Ravenmere's accounts for the past 2 years. Cross-referenced, annotated in Lyra's precise handwriting, with discrepancies highlighted and sourced to their origin points. And the discrepancies led, with the mathematical inevitability of water flowing downhill, to 3 names. The same 3 merchant houses in Ashenmere that held the tariff exemptions. The same 3 houses that Colum the grain merchant had identified as consolidators, buying harvests at suppressed prices. The same 3 houses that, according to Lyra's annotations, shared a single silent investor whose identity was concealed behind a chain of shell companies and proxy accounts. Aldrich followed the chain. It took him 40 minutes. When he reached the end, he sat down in Lyra's chair and stared at the wall for a very long time. The silent investor was Seraphine. Not Seraphine alone. Seraphine in partnership with a financial entity registered in Greycliff, an entity whose authorization documents bore a witness signature that matched the personal seal of Lord Heron Drace. Aldrich felt the ground shift beneath him, not metaphorically. The actual physical sensation of a man realizing that the crisis he thought he understood was several orders of magnitude larger than his worst projection. This was not an affair, this was not a succession dispute, this was a coordinated operation. Seraphine inside the walls, redirecting funds and reshaping legal documents. Drace outside the walls, probing borders and positioning forces. The affair had never been about passion, it had been about access. About installing an asset inside the most powerful household in the Dominion and using that asset to hollow out the financial and legal infrastructure from within. Lyra had seen it, Lyra had documented it, and Lyra had left because staying meant being eliminated before she could act on what she knew. Aldrich gathered the documents. He locked the desk. He walked back toward the West Tower with the careful, measured pace of a man carrying something that could either save an empire or detonate it, depending entirely on who received the information first and what they chose to do with it. He found Cassian alone in the study. The garrison briefing had ended. The Duke stood at the window in the posture that had become his default over the past 9 days, staring outward, searching the white landscape for something he could not name and would not find by looking. "Sit down," Aldrich said. Cassian turned. Something in Aldrich's voice registered as different. Not the usual advisory caution. Not the diplomatic cushioning, something raw and immediate and afraid. "What happened?" "Sit down, Cassian." The Duke sat, and Aldrich placed the documents on the desk between them the way a surgeon places instruments on a tray before an operation that may or may not save the patient. "Your wife has been conducting a financial investigation for at least 2 years, Aldrich said. She documented everything, the tariff irregularities, the fund diversions, the shell companies. All of it leads to the same endpoint, which is, Seraphine is a business partner of Heron Drace. The affair, the will, the succession revision, all of it was designed to transfer legal control of Blackthorne's assets to an entity that Drace controls. Your mistress is not your mistress. She is an operative, and she is currently sleeping 1 floor below your study with full access to your household, your correspondence, and your security protocols." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a structure failing. The deep, internal, almost geological sound of a man's entire understanding of the past 18 months collapsing and rearranging itself into a pattern he should have seen and did not, because he was too busy being the version of himself that Seraphine had designed him to be. The version that confused attention with affection. The version that mistook strategic flattery for genuine recognition. The version that needed so desperately to be seen as something more than a title and a territory that he had opened the gates of his empire to the exact person sent to destroy it. Cassian looked at the documents spread across his desk. Lyra's handwriting, Lyra's research, Lyra's work, done in silence, done in the margins of a life he had dismissed as decorative, done with the same invisible competence that had rebuilt his treasury and brokered his alliances and managed his empire while he took the credit and gave the inheritance to someone else. "Where is she?" he asked. "I believe she's in the western districts, documenting the damage on the ground." "Bring her home." "She doesn't want to come home, Cassian. She left because home was the most dangerous place for her to be." "Then make it safe." "You cannot make it safe while Seraphine is inside these walls." Cassian stood. He moved to the window and pressed both hands against the glass until his knuckles whitened. Outside, the snow had stopped again. The landscape lay exposed and hard under a sky that offered no comfort and no cover. "If I move against Seraphine now, Drace will know within hours. He'll interpret it as an act of aggression and accelerate whatever military positioning he's already begun." "Yes. And if I don't move against her, she continues to operate from inside my household with access to everything." "Yes." "Then I'm already at war. I just didn't know it." "You've been at war for 18 months. Your wife knew it. She fought it alone because you were too busy being in love with the enemy to notice." The words landed like a blade across an open wound. Cassian did not flinch. He stood at the window and let the full weight of the statement settle into his body, into his chest, into the place where the carefully maintained architecture of his self-image had been standing for 4 decades and was now, finally, irreversibly, beginning to fall. Outside, a rider appeared on the southern road. Then another. Then a formation of 12, moving in the tight, disciplined pattern of military scouts returning from a reconnaissance mission. They were not Cassian's scouts. They wore no house colors, and they were heading directly for the gates of Ravenmere. The riders did not stop at the gates. They passed through them. 12 men in unmarked leather and steel, moving with the synchronized discipline of soldiers who had rehearsed this approach, and the gate captain let them through without challenge, because the woman riding at the center of the formation carried a sealed document bearing the crest of the Dominion Trade Council, which granted unrestricted passage to any holding within Blackthorne's borders. Cassian watched from the tower window as the formation crossed the courtyard and dismounted in front of the great hall entrance with the unhurried efficiency of men who expected to be received. "Those are not scouts," Aldrich said from behind him. "No. Those are an escort detail. Professional. Paid." "I can see that. The question is who paid them and who they're escorting." The answer arrived 3 minutes later when a servant knocked on the study door and announced that a representative of the Dominion Trade Council had arrived bearing an emergency petition for the Duke's immediate review. The representative's name was Magistrate Eldon Graves, and the petition concerned irregularities in the Blackthorne succession registry that had been flagged by 3 independent merchant houses operating out of Ashenmere. Cassian felt something tighten behind his sternum. Not fear. Something older than fear. The instinct of a predator who realizes, mid-stride, that the ground beneath him has been prepared by someone else. "She's fast," he said quietly. Aldrich understood immediately. "You think Seraphine arranged this?" "I think Seraphine has been arranging things for 18 months, and I have been too busy enjoying the arrangement to notice the architecture. Get Voss. Full security detail in the Great Hall, and find out where Seraphine is right now. She's in her chamber. She hasn't left since. Find out where she actually is. Not where she says she is, not where her maid says she is, where she is." Aldrich left. Cassian stood alone in the study for exactly 12 seconds. In those 12 seconds, the internal rearrangement that had begun when Aldrich showed him Lyra's documents completed its work. The man who had walked into this room 9 days ago believing he controlled an empire and managed a discreet affair and possessed a wife who would endure anything, that man was gone, burned down to the foundation by the accumulated evidence of his own blindness. What remained was something stripped and functional. A duke who understood for the first time in his adult life that the survival skills he had spent decades perfecting had been pointed in the wrong direction. He had fortified every external wall. He had neglected the ones inside his own house. Magistrate Eldon Graves was a man designed by decades of bureaucratic service to be fundamentally unmemorable. Medium height, medium build, a face that belonged in a crowd rather than at the head of a table. He wore the dark formal robes of the Trade Council judiciary, and his hands, when he placed the petition document on the Great Hall table, were perfectly steady. the steadiness of a man who had done this before and understood that the document he carried was not paper, but ordnance. Cassian entered the great hall flanked by Commander Voss and 2 senior guards. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the table and looked down at Graves with the full weight of a duke whose authority had been built on the understanding that physical presence was itself a form of argument. Magistrate. Your Grace, I apologize for the unannounced arrival. The matter required urgency. Urgency defined by whom? By the evidence, Your Grace. Graves opened a leather portfolio and began placing documents on the table one by one. Each document bore official seals, notarized signatures, cross-references to registry entries that Cassian recognized because he had signed some of them himself. The petition was structured with surgical precision. It alleged that the Blackthorne succession registry had been altered without proper judicial oversight, that beneficiary changes had been made to the ducal will using documentation that bore irregularities consistent with forgery, that funds from the Blackthorne estate had been diverted to private entities through channels designed to circumvent standard audit procedures, and that these actions, taken together, constituted grounds for a formal investigation by the Trade Council judiciary into the administrative integrity of the Blackthorne succession. Every allegation pointed at Cassian, not at Seraphine, at Cassian. The realization hit him like cold water. He had been bracing for an attack on Seraphine's legitimacy. Instead, the attack was on his. The petition did not mention Seraphine by name. It did not reference the affair. It referenced only the Duke's unilateral modifications to legal documents, the Duke's financial diversions, the Duke's failure to maintain proper succession protocols. It transformed the victim into the perpetrator and erased the actual architect of the corruption entirely. Who filed this petition? Cassian asked. His voice was level. The effort it required to keep it level was enormous. 3 merchant houses, Ashenmere registered. Their names are in the filing. The same 3 houses. The same 3 houses that held the tariff exemptions. The same 3 houses connected to Seraphine's shell companies. The same 3 houses that Lyra's research had identified as the financial conduit for Drace's investment in Blackthorne's internal economy. They were using his own corruption against him, not to expose the conspiracy, but to legitimize it. If the Trade Council investigated and found that Cassian had indeed altered succession documents and diverted funds, which he had, then the remedy would be judicial oversight of the succession process. That oversight would freeze his authority to make further changes. It would lock the existing legal framework in place. And the existing legal framework, thanks to the revised will he had signed 6 weeks ago, named Seraphine as primary beneficiary. They were not attacking him. They were trapping him inside his own decisions. I will review the petition with my counsel, Cassian said. You will be provided quarters for the duration. Your Grace, the petition requires a formal response within, you will be provided quarters for the duration. Graves recognized the edge in the Duke's voice and calculated correctly that pressing further would produce consequences the Trade Council could not officially endorse. He gathered his documents, bowed precisely, and withdrew with his escort. The moment the doors closed, Cassian turned to Voss. Lock the gates. No one enters or leaves without my direct authorization. No couriers, no merchants, no one. My lord, that will do it. Voss left. Cassian stood alone in the great hall, surrounded by empty chairs and the lingering presence of a bureaucratic assault that had been engineered with the same precision Lyra used to organize diplomatic functions. Every piece in place, every angle covered, every escape route anticipated and sealed. He was not accustomed to being outmaneuvered. He was not built for it. The experience produced in him something that felt dangerously close to admiration, and he hated himself for it because the admiration was directed at the people destroying him, and the one person who had tried to protect him was somewhere in the frozen countryside documenting evidence that might already be too late to use. Aldrich found him 20 minutes later. Seraphine is in the library, Aldrich reported. She has been there since dawn. The staff confirms it. What is she doing in the library? Reading, or appearing to read. She has requested access to the household correspondence archive. Deny it. Already done. Cassian, there's more. Voss's men intercepted a messenger at the south gate before your lockdown order. The messenger was carrying a sealed letter addressed to a receiving house in Greycliff. The seal matches the one used on the letter Seraphine sent the night Lyra disappeared. Open it. I need your authorization to break a noble's personal seal. You have it. Aldrich produced the letter. He broke the seal with a small knife and unfolded the single page. He read it once. Then he handed it to Cassian without commentary, because the contents required no interpretation. The letter was addressed to Lord Heron Drace. It informed him that the Trade Council petition had been delivered on schedule, that the succession freeze was expected within 14 days, that the Duke's capacity to alter legal documents would be suspended pending investigation, and that the final phase, the formal recognition of Seraphine's beneficiary status through judicial confirmation, could proceed once the investigation concluded in the petitioner's favor. The final line read, "The garrison withdrawal from the southern corridor creates the opening we discussed. Ashenmere will be undefended by the first thaw." Cassian read the letter twice. He folded it and placed it on the table with the careful deliberation of a man handling something that might detonate. "She sold my military positions to Drace." "She sold everything to Drace. Your positions, your succession, your financial architecture, everything you gave her access to, she monetized." "I gave her access to everything." "Yes, you did." The silence that followed was the sound of a man standing in the wreckage of his own judgment. Cassian had survived border wars, financial crises, political assassinations, a dozen forms of external threat that would have broken weaker men. He had survived them because he understood that the world operated on leverage, and that the man who held more leverage controlled the outcome. But leverage required information, and for 18 months, every piece of information he possessed had been filtered through a woman whose purpose was to ensure he saw exactly what she wanted him to see and nothing else. Seraphine had not deceived him through superior intelligence. She had deceived him through his own need, the need to be desired, the need to be chosen, the need to believe that a beautiful woman's attention validated something in him that Lyra's steady, competent, invisible devotion never reached. That was the wound, not vanity, something deeper and uglier. The suspicion, buried so far beneath his public authority that he had never examined it directly, that he was not lovable, that he was only useful. And when Seraphine arrived and looked at him as if he were more than a function, more than a title, more than a machine that produced power and security for everyone who depended on him, he had opened every gate and lowered every defense because the alternative was continuing to live inside the question he could not bear to answer. Am I enough without the crown? Seraphine had answered yes. And the answer was a weapon. He crossed the great hall and walked toward the library. Aldrich followed 3 steps behind, close enough to intervene, far enough to signal that this was the Duke's confrontation, not his counsel's. The library of Ravenmere Castle occupied an entire floor of the central keep, floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound volumes, reading alcoves with leaded glass windows, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and at a table near the east windows, bathed in thin winter light, Seraphine sat with an open book and a posture of such composed tranquility that it constituted its own form of defiance. She looked up when Cassian entered. Her expression was calibrated to project mild concern, the kind of face a supportive partner offers a stressed man who needs comfort. It was flawless, and it was now that Cassian could see the machinery behind it, absolutely terrifying. "You look exhausted," she said. "The magistrate, when did Drace first contact you?" The question landed without preamble or cushion. Seraphine's face held its position for exactly 1 beat too long. That beat was the space between performance and truth, and Cassian saw it the way a hunter sees a branch move in a forest that should be still. "I don't understand the question." "You understand it perfectly. When did Drace first contact you, before or after the reception where we met?" "Cassian, what are you—" "Before or after?" She closed the book. The gesture was slow, deliberate, the act of a woman buying seconds to calculate her next position. Her eyes moved across his face the way they always did, searching for the angle of approach, the vulnerability, the pressure point that would redirect the conversation toward ground she controlled. But the map had changed. The man standing in front of her was not the man she had been managing. Something in his architecture had shifted, and for the first time, Seraphine could not find the door she usually entered through. "Everything I have done has been for us," she said, "for our future, for the child." The child that gives you succession rights. The child that makes you legally indistinguishable from a wife. The child that Drace needs to exist because without it, the beneficiary claim collapses and his investment in your operation becomes worthless. Seraphine stood. The composure cracked. Not dramatically, not the theatrical collapse of a woman caught in deception, but the controlled fracture of a professional whose operational cover has been blown and who understands that the next 30 seconds will determine whether she walks out of this room with any leverage at all. You want to talk about operations? Fine. Let me tell you about operations. I came from nothing. A bloodline and a name and not a single coin to make either one worth keeping. Do you know what that means for a woman in this world? It means you are a decorative asset to be traded between houses for political advantage. It means your intelligence is a liability because no one wants a sharp wife. They want a compliant one. It means you learn very early that the only power available to you is the power someone else is willing to share, and sharing requires proximity, and proximity requires being exactly what they need you to be. So I was a mark. You were an opportunity. The same way every alliance in your career has been an opportunity. The same way your marriage to Lyra was an opportunity. Her family's trade connections, her financial competence. You married capability, Cassian. I simply offered a different kind. You offered treason. I offered survival, mine, which is something you have never had to think about because you were born into a castle with your name already carved above the gates. Cassian absorbed this. He absorbed it not as justification, but as information, the way a field commander absorbs intelligence about an enemy's motivation, because understanding why someone fights tells you how they will retreat. Seraphine was not a villain in her own narrative. She was a survivor operating in a system that offered her exactly two roles, ornament or weapon, and she had chosen weapon because ornaments get discarded when the season changes. That understanding did not change what he had to do. Where is Drace positioning his forces? Cassian asked. I'm not going to. You are standing in my castle, in my dominion, under my authority. The letter to Drace has been intercepted. The Trade Council petition has been identified as a coordinated attack. You have no leverage left, Seraphine. The only currency you have is information, and in about 4 minutes, Commander Voss is going to walk through that door with a detention order. So I will ask you one more time. Where is Drace positioning his forces? The silence between them lasted long enough for the fire to settle. Seraphine's face underwent a transformation that Cassian would remember for years. The mask did not simply drop. It dissolved. Layer by layer, the constructed persona of the devoted lover, the concerned partner, the woman who saw him, peeled away, and what remained was something rawer and more honest than anything she had shown him in 18 months of intimacy. A woman who was afraid, not of punishment, of irrelevance, of returning to the poverty and invisibility that she had clawed her way out of by any means available. The southern corridor, she said, 300 men, mixed infantry and mounted. They'll move when the thaw opens the Ashenmere Road. What's the objective? Ashenmere itself, the merchant quarter. Control the trade hub, control the revenue. Drace doesn't want your title, he wants your economy. And your role after the takeover? Regent for the heir, managing Blackthorne's finances under Drace's military protection until the child comes of age. Regent. Cassian repeated the word the way you repeat a diagnosis that confirms something you suspected but hoped to avoid. You would have ruled my duchy in my child's name while Drace controlled the borders and bled the treasury. I would have survived, which is more than your current trajectory offers either of us. Cassian turned to Aldrich. Detainer, private quarters in the North Tower, no correspondence, no visitors, guards at all access points. Cassian, do not say my name. You lost the right to use it the moment you sold my garrison positions to a man who wants to dismantle everything I built. Everything you built. Seraphine's voice went quiet, bitter. Everything Lyra built. That is the truth you still cannot say out loud, isn't it? She built it. You wore it. And I tried to take it from her because I thought it was yours to give. Voss entered with 2 guards. Seraphine was escorted from the library without resistance. She walked between the guards with her spine straight and her chin level and not a single glance backward. Whatever she was, coward was not among the options. The library door closed. Cassian stood among the books, and the silence, and felt the full weight of the past 18 months collapse onto his shoulders like a ceiling giving way. The affair, the will, the financial diversions, the tariff policies that gutted his western districts, the garrison withdrawal that left Ashenmere exposed. Every decision that had seemed private and personal and contained within the boundaries of his own desire had been, in reality, a tile in a mosaic designed by someone else. He had been the instrument of his own destruction, and the most devastating part was not that he had been deceived. The most devastating part was that the deception had required so little effort. Seraphine had not needed to be brilliant. She had only needed to stand in front of a man who was starving and offer him food. "I need to find Lyra," he said. "You need to prepare for war," Aldrich said. "Drace has 300 men staging for a spring assault. Your southern garrison is pulled back. Your trade council is compromised. Your succession is legally frozen. And your wife, wherever she is, has the only complete set of evidence that proves this was a coordinated operation rather than your personal corruption. Then I need to find Lyra and prepare for war simultaneously." "You can't do both from Ravenmere." Cassian looked at Aldrich. Something passed between them that was not quite agreement and not quite forgiveness, but existed in the space where two men who have known each other long enough to dispense with performance simply acknowledge the shape of what is real. "You want me to leave the castle," Cassian said. "I want you to go find your wife. Personally. Not with riders and search parties and the full apparatus of ducal authority. Personally. Because the woman who holds the evidence that can save your dominion does not trust your riders or your search parties or your authority. She trusts you. Or she did once. And if there is anything left of that trust, you are going to need it more than you have ever needed any army or alliance or political maneuver in your entire life. And Ravenmere? I'll hold Ravenmere. Voss and I can maintain defensive posture through the winter. Drace won't move before the thaw. That gives you weeks, not months, but weeks." Cassian walked to the window. Below, the courtyard lay under gray light. The horses were still saddled from the morning patrols. Somewhere in the west wing, Seraphine was being led into confined quarters by men who had, until this morning, addressed her with the deference reserved for the Duke's chosen companion. And somewhere in the western territories, riding through villages that his policies had damaged and his attention had abandoned, his wife was doing the work that he should have been doing for 14 years, seeing what he refused to see, recording what he refused to acknowledge, building the case that could either save him or bury him, depending on whether she decided he was worth saving. That was the question he could not answer from inside a castle. He had spent his entire life operating from positions of strength, high ground, superior numbers, better intelligence, the fundamental assumption that power flows from the top down, and that the man at the top controls the current. Every instinct he possessed told him to stay. Fortify, command. Manage the crisis from the center of his authority, where every resource was at his disposal, and every subordinate moved at his direction. But authority was exactly what had blinded him. The walls he commanded from had become the walls he could not see past. The subordinates who moved at his direction included one who had been directing him. And the resources at his disposal had been quietly redirected to fund his own destruction. Going to Lyra meant leaving all of it behind. The title, the guards, the strategic advantage of position. It meant walking into the territories he had neglected, facing the damage he had caused, and asking a woman he had betrayed to give him something he had never offered her, the truth about what he had become, and whether anything worth saving still existed beneath it. It meant becoming, for the first time in his life, a man without leverage. Cassian turned from the window. He looked at Aldrich with an expression that his oldest friend had never seen before, not because it was unfamiliar, but because Cassian had never allowed it to reach his face, stripped, uncertain, human in the way that powerful men spend their careers learning not to be. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I know," Aldrich said. "That is exactly why you have to." Cassian left Ravenmere before nightfall, riding west on a single horse with no escort, no banner, no insignia of rank. He carried Lyra's documents in a weatherproof satchel, a change of clothes, enough provisions for 5 days, and the intercepted letter that proved everything Seraphine had done. He wore a heavy riding cloak that concealed whatever remained of the Duke of Blackthorne beneath its folds. The snow had started again. It fell around him in the fading light, covering the road ahead with a whiteness that erased all evidence of direction. He rode into it without knowing where she was, without knowing if she would receive him, without knowing if the woman who had spent 14 years being invisible to him would even recognize the man who was finally, desperately, trying to see her. Behind him, the towers of Ravenmere grew smaller against the darkening sky. Ahead, there was only winter, and the ruins of everything he had refused to build when building it would have been easy. He rode for 3 days through a landscape that did not care who he was. That was the first lesson. The snow fell on dukes and farmers with identical indifference. The wind cut through ermine-lined cloaks with the same efficiency it applied to burlap, and the frozen roads of the Western Territories, rutted and crumbling from 2 years of deferred maintenance that his trade council had approved and his wife had flagged and he had ignored, made no distinction between a warhorse carrying a sovereign and a draft animal hauling grain. The road simply broke what moved across it, equally, without negotiation. Cassian had not traveled without an escort since he was 26. 15 years of guards and advance riders and outriders scanning the terrain, a moving perimeter of vigilance that allowed him to occupy space without ever truly feeling it. Now the space closed in. The cold was specific. The hunger was personal. The silence of a winter landscape at dusk, when the light drains from the sky like blood from a wound, and the world reduces itself to white ground and black trees and the sound of a single horse breathing, that silence had a weight he had never been asked to carry. He stopped in villages. He asked questions. A woman traveling alone, dark hair, plain riding clothes. "Have you seen her?" In Brackenmire, an innkeeper squinted at him across a counter, stained with decades of spilled ale, and said he looked like a man who had lost something important and was only now realizing how long it had been missing. "She passed through 4 days ago," the innkeeper said. "Stayed 1 night, talked to the village council, asked questions about the water supply and the bridge repairs." "Where did she go?" "West, toward Thornfield." "Did she say anything about where she was headed after?" "She said she was documenting. Didn't say what. Didn't need to. Everyone around here knows what needs documenting. We've been sending reports to Ravenmere for 2 years. They disappear like letters thrown into a well." Cassian absorbed the statement without defending himself. That restraint cost him something. Not pride exactly. Pride was the surface material. What it cost him was the comfortable architecture of a man who believed his empire functioned because he managed it competently. These villages were not failing despite his management. They were failing because of it. Because management, in Cassian's operational definition, had always meant controlling outputs and optimizing returns, and the humans who lived inside that system were treated as variables in an equation, rather than people whose survival depended on the equation working in both directions. He reached Thornfield on the 4th day. The village was larger than Brackenmire, built around a crossroads that had once been a thriving market junction. Now half the market stalls stood empty. The bridge over the Thornfield River, which connected the village to the main trade road, had been reinforced with timber planks that looked temporary and had clearly been in place for over a year. Cassian dismounted and led his horse across the bridge and felt the structure flex under the combined weight in a way that sent a cold signal through his legs into his spine. This bridge was going to collapse, not in a dramatic sudden failure, but in the slow, incremental way that neglected infrastructure fails, one load-bearing element at a time until the whole thing simply stops holding. Like his marriage, like his dominion, like every structure he had built by extracting maximum performance from foundations he never reinforced. He found her in the village physician's house, not by tracking or investigation, by accident. He walked into the physician's surgery because his horse had developed a limp on the last stretch of road, and the physician was the only person in Thornfield who also treated animals, and Lyra was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing documents with a woman he did not recognize. She saw him before he saw her. That mattered. It meant she had a full 3 seconds to compose her reaction, and what she composed was not surprise or anger or relief, but a stillness so complete it functioned as a wall. She sat at that table and looked at her husband standing in the doorway of a village physician's house, filthy from 4 days of riding, his ducal authority invisible beneath road dust and exhaustion, and she gave him nothing. No emotion to read, no entry point to exploit, Just the flat, measured regard of a woman who had spent 14 years learning that vulnerability in his presence was a resource he consumed without replenishing. Lyra, you found me. I've been writing for 4 days. You've been writing for 4 days because you only started looking in the right direction 4 days ago. The wrong direction took you 9 days. That's 13 days to find a woman who never hid. The physician, a gray-haired woman named Hale, who had practiced medicine in the Western Territories for 30 years, stood from the table and excused herself with the pointed efficiency of someone who recognized a conversation that needed to happen without witnesses. She took Cassian's horse to the small stable behind the house and closed the door behind her with a firmness that suggested she had opinions about dukes who showed up unannounced in her kitchen. Cassian stood in the doorway. Lyra remained seated. The distance between them was 8 feet of worn wooden floor, and it might as well have been the width of the Dominion. I read your documents, he said. The financial records, the shell company connections, Seraphine, Drace, all of it. I know. How do you know? Because Aldrich would have found them by now, and Aldrich would have shown them to you, and you would not be here in a village physician's kitchen looking like a man who hasn't slept in a week, unless something fundamental had changed in the way you see the situation. Everything has changed. Has it? Not a question. A measurement. She was testing the weight of the statement the way an engineer tests a beam before trusting it with a load. Seraphine is detained. The letter to Drace was intercepted. I know about the Trade Council petition, the succession freeze, the Southern garrison, the 300 men staging in Greycliff. I know all of it. And I know that you saw it before anyone, before Aldrich, before Voss, before me. You saw it and you documented it, and you left because staying in Ravenmere meant being eliminated before you could use what you found. Lyra folded her hands on the table. The gesture was precise, contained, the kind of self-control that is only necessary when the alternative is something uncontrollable. I left because you wrote a will that erased me from the future of an empire I built with my own hands. Everything else, the conspiracy, the documentation, the investigation, all of it came after. I need you to understand that. I did not leave because I discovered a plot. I left because my husband looked at 14 years of partnership and decided it was worth a country house and a stipend. The words entered Cassian's body like rounds from a weapon designed for close-range damage. Not the explosive impact of a cannonball, but the precise, penetrating efficiency of something built to reach vital organs. He stood in the doorway and felt each word arrive in sequence, and understood that there was no defense available because the accusation was not an interpretation. It was a description. He had done exactly what she said. He had done it with legal precision and bureaucratic thoroughness and the quiet confidence of a man who believed his decisions existed in a realm separate from their consequences. I know, he said. 2 words. They were the hardest 2 words he had ever spoken. Not because they were complex, but because they required the demolition of every justification he had constructed over 18 months to protect himself from exactly this moment. The rationalizations, the entitlement, the narrative he had told himself about a cold marriage and a passionate alternative, and the natural prerogatives of powerful men. All of it had to be torn down before those 2 words could exist. And tearing it down meant standing in the wreckage without the scaffolding of self-deception that had been holding him upright. Lyra studied him for a long time. Whatever she was looking for, she did not immediately find it or did not trust what she found. 14 years of watching a man perform emotions had given her an advanced understanding of the difference between genuine feeling and strategic display, and Cassian had to stand inside her scrutiny and accept that he had earned this doubt. Every false reassurance, every deflected question, every time he had used charm as a substitute for honesty had contributed to a deficit of credibility so deep that even genuine remorse would be received with suspicion. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want you to come back to Ravenmere." "Why?" "Because Drace is going to attack in the spring. Because the Trade Council petition will freeze the succession unless we can prove the filing was part of a coordinated conspiracy. Because your documentation is the only evidence that connects Seraphine's financial operations to Drace's military positioning. Because without you, the Dominion falls." "That is why the Duke wants me back. I asked what you want." The distinction cracked something open in his chest that he had been holding sealed for years. The Duke, the function, The role that consumed every human dimension of his identity and replaced it with operational necessity. Lyra had lived inside that function for 14 years, and she was asking him, perhaps for the first time, to step outside it and speak from whatever remained. I want the chance to be worth something to you beyond what I control. Lyra's hands tightened on the table. The knuckles whitened. A reaction she could not compose away, and the fact that she could not compose it away was itself a kind of answer. Anger is easy to maintain towards someone you have stopped caring about. It is the residual caring that makes anger hurt. We don't have time for this conversation, she said, not the version of it that matters. Drace has 300 men and he'll have more by spring. Seraphine's detention buys time, but it doesn't neutralize the petition. And the Western Territories, Cassian, the villages I've been riding through for 2 weeks, they are hollowed out. Your tariff policies destroyed the independent farming economy. Your trade council redirected medical supplies to fund a castle renovation. Your bridge maintenance budget was diverted to military procurement. These people have been surviving in spite of your governance, not because of it. And if Drace attacks, they have no reason to defend a duke who never defended them. Then we give them a reason. How? By doing what you've been doing, seeing the damage, fixing it, not from Ravenmere, here, on the ground, village by village. Lyra looked at him with something that was not forgiveness and not trust, but existed in the narrow space between the two. The space where a woman who has been betrayed evaluates whether the man in front of her is capable of becoming someone different or is simply performing transformation because the situation demands it. You would need to renounce the tariff structure publicly, restore the farming subsidies, fund the bridge repairs and medical allocations from the military surplus. That means weakening your garrison budget by at least 30% during the exact period when Drace is preparing to attack. I know what it means. It means choosing between the people who live inside your borders and the walls that protect them. You cannot fund both. Then we fund the people and find another way to hold the walls. The decision came out of him with a clarity that surprised them both. Not because it was strategically sound, it was strategically insane, reducing military spending while an enemy mobilized on your border, but because it emerged from a place in Cassian's thinking that had never been consulted before. The place that understood, with the raw clarity of a man who had ridden through his own neglected territories for 4 days and seen the evidence of his failure in every collapsed bridge and empty market stall, that an empire defended by walls alone is an empire already lost. Walls protect structures. People defend homes. And the difference between a structure and a home was exactly the difference between the duke he had been and the duke he needed to become. They rode back toward Ravenmere together, not side by side. Lyra maintained a distance of 10 feet between their horses that functioned as a physical metaphor for the emotional gap that no single conversation could bridge. They traveled through the villages she had documented, and in each one she stopped and introduced him, not as the duke, but as the man responsible for the policies that had caused the damage. And she made him listen while farmers and merchants and magistrates described in specific, granular, human detail what his governance had cost them. In Alden Moor, a physician named Trent told him that 3 people had died last winter from illnesses that basic medical supplies would have prevented. The supplies had been redirected to Ravenmere's South Wing renovation budget. In Brackenmire, the village council presented him with 2 years of unanswered correspondence requesting bridge maintenance, road repair, and agricultural support. Every letter bore the official stamp of the Ravenmere administration acknowledging receipt. None had received a response. Cassian listened to all of it. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. He did not deploy the strategic charisma that had built his political career on the ability to reframe failures as necessary sacrifices. He simply stood in the cold and absorbed the accumulated weight of everything his ambition had crushed. And each conversation stripped away another layer of the protective architecture that had allowed him to function as a duke without functioning as a human being. On the 3rd night of the return journey, camped in a farmhouse outside Millhaven, a rider from Ravenmere reached them. The rider was young, frostbitten, and terrified. He carried a sealed message from Aldrich that contained 7 words. "Drace is moving early. Come now." Cassian read the message and felt time compress around him like a fist. The thaw was still weeks away. The southern roads were barely passable. For Drace to move his forces now, in winter, through mountain passes that would cost him men and horses to attrition before he reached the first objective, meant something had changed in his calculation. Something had accelerated the timeline beyond the careful schedule outlined in Seraphine's intercepted letter. "He knows she's been detained," Lyra said, reading the conclusion on his face. The moment Drace lost communication with Seraphine, he knew the operation was compromised. "He's moving now because waiting means you have time to prepare. We're 3 days from Ravenmere." "Then we don't go to Ravenmere." Cassian looked at her. "Drace is coming through the southern corridor toward Ashenmere," Lyra said. "If he takes the merchant quarter, he controls the revenue and the Trade Council jurisdiction. Ravenmere becomes economically isolated. You could hold the castle for months and still lose the Dominion because the wealth that sustains it would be in his hands. Aldrich needs reinforcement at... Aldrich has Voss and the castle garrison. Ravenmere can defend itself. Ashenmere cannot. There is no garrison there. You pulled it back 3 weeks ago on a withdrawal order that Seraphine recommended." The realization landed like a blade between ribs. Every tactical decision he had made in the past months had been shaped by Seraphine's counsel. The garrison withdrawal, the southern corridor exposed, the resources concentrated at Ravenmere, while the economic heart of the Dominion was left undefended. He had not merely been deceived, he had been operated like a machine, each input designed to produce an output that served someone else's objective. "How do we hold Ashenmere without a garrison?" he asked. Lyra pulled the map from her saddlebag, the one she had been annotating for 2 weeks with village locations, population numbers, resource inventories, and the names of local leaders she had met during her journey through the Western Territories. "We hold it with the people you stopped seeing 10 years ago. Every village I visited has men who served in the territorial militia before your trade council disbanded it to cut costs. Farmers who know the terrain better than any professional soldier. Merchants who understand the Ashenmere road system because they've been hauling goods along it their entire lives. They won't fight for a duke who ignored them, but they might fight for a duke who just spent 3 days standing in their villages listening to what he did wrong. That's not an army, that's a conscription drive built on guilt. No, it's an alliance built on accountability. There is a difference, and if you cannot see it, then you have learned nothing in the past 2 weeks and I have wasted my time." He could see it. That was the terrifying part. Standing in a frozen farmhouse with a map spread across a table that smelled of wood smoke and old grain, Cassian could see the shape of what Lyra was describing, and it was the inverse of everything he had built his career on. He had always led from the top down, authority flowing outward from the center, loyalty extracted through leverage and maintained through the implicit threat of consequences. What Lyra was proposing was leadership built from the ground up, not command, partnership. The willingness to stand beside people rather than above them and ask for their strength rather than demand it. It was the most vulnerable strategic position he had ever considered, and it was the only one available. They rode south at dawn. 2 riders. No escort, no banner. Moving fast along those back roads that Lyra had mapped during her 2 weeks in the field, the roads that did not appear on any official duchy cartography because they connected places that official cartography did not consider important. Farm tracks. Mill roads. The paths that grain wagons and livestock drovers and traveling physicians used to move between communities that the central government had stopped servicing. In every village they passed through, Lyra stopped. She spoke to the people she had met during her initial journey. She told them what was coming: Drace's forces, the threat to Ashenmere, the potential collapse of the trade infrastructure that every farming community in the Western Territories depended on for market access. She did not exaggerate. She did not appeal to patriotism or ducal loyalty. She told them the truth, which was that the Duke had failed them, and that the same Duke was now asking for their help, not because he deserved it, but because the alternative was an occupation by a border lord whose record of territorial management was even worse. And the remarkable thing, the thing Cassian watched with an astonishment he could not conceal, was that they listened. Not because she was persuasive, but because she was credible. She had walked through their villages. She had sat in their council meetings. She had documented their grievances with the thoroughness of someone who believed their problems mattered. And that documentation, that simple act of seeing and recording, had created something that no amount of ducal authority could manufacture. Trust. By the time they reached the outskirts of Ashenmere 3 days later, they were no longer 2 riders. They were 60. Farmers on workhorses, former militia veterans on borrowed mounts, merchants driving supply wagons loaded with provisions, medical supplies, and the improvised weapons of men who had learned to defend their holdings against bandits and predators long before any garrison was assigned to protect them. 60 was not 300. 60 against a professional military force was a calculation that produced one outcome under conventional analysis. But conventional analysis assumed that the defenders would be operating under conventional command, and the woman riding at the head of this formation had never commanded anything conventionally. They reached Ashenmere at dusk. The merchant quarter spread along the river in a half-moon of stone buildings, warehouses, trading halls, and counting houses that together represented approximately 40% of Blackthorne Dominion's annual revenue. In peacetime, it was a place of noise and commerce and the aggressive optimism of people whose livelihood depended on the movement of goods. Now it was quiet. Word of the approaching force had reached the town through the same informal networks that carried market prices and weather predictions, and the merchants had begun closing their operations and preparing to evacuate. Cassian rode into the town square and dismounted. The merchants who remained watched him with the specific wariness of people who understood that the man responsible for their predicament was now claiming to be their protector. He could feel their doubt like a physical substance in the air, and for the first time in his life, he did not try to dispel it through authority or charisma. He let it exist. He stood inside it. "I know what I owe you," he said to the crowd that gathered. "I know what my policies cost this town, and every town between here and Ravenmere. I'm not asking you to forget that. I'm asking you to help me stop something worse." It was not a speech that would be remembered for its eloquence. It was remembered for its brevity and for the fact that the man delivering it looked like he meant it, not because he had practiced meaning it, but because 4 days of riding through the evidence of his own failures had burned away every layer of performance until only the raw material remained. Lyra organized the defense. She worked through the night, converting the merchant quarter into a defensive position using the same organizational precision she had applied to Ravenmere's treasury. Warehouse entrances were barricaded. Supply lines were established along the river. Militia veterans were positioned at choke points that Lyra identified not through military training, but through an intimate understanding of how goods and people moved through commercial spaces. She knew where the narrow alleys were. She knew which buildings had stone walls thick enough to stop arrows and which had wooden upper stories that would burn. She knew the river crossings and the back exits and the rooftop lines that connected warehouse to warehouse above street level. Cassian watched her work and understood, with a clarity that shamed him, that he was watching the person who had been running his empire for 14 years finally operating without the constraint of his shadow. This was who Lyra was when she was not performing the role of decorative silence. This was the mind that had rebuilt his treasury, brokered his alliances, managed his diplomatic corps, and documented a conspiracy that his own intelligence apparatus had missed entirely. And he had written her out of his will because a beautiful woman had made him feel seen. The scouts reported at dawn. Drace's vanguard was 6 hours south, 200 men advancing along the main road. The remaining 100 would follow within a day. Professional soldiers, well-equipped, moving with the disciplined pace of a force that expected to occupy, not to fight. They expected an empty town. Cassian stood on the roof of the central trading hall and looked south along the road that Drace's forces would travel. The morning light was pale and cold. His breath formed clouds that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Below him, 60 defenders and 40 townspeople who had chosen to stay were completing the defensive preparations that Lyra had designed through the night. He felt his heartbeat in his throat, in his fingertips, in the damaged muscles of his shoulders that had been carrying the weight of command for 2 decades and were now carrying something heavier. Responsibility without authority. Leadership without leverage. The terrifying, clarifying experience of standing in front of people who owed him nothing and asking them to stand with him anyway. Lyra climbed to the rooftop and stood beside him. Not close, not touching, but beside him, facing the same direction. "They'll hit the southern approach first," she said. "Standard column formation. They won't expect resistance, so the initial contact will be disorganized on their side. That's our window. If we can break their momentum in the first engagement, we force them to regroup and reassess. Every hour they spend reassessing is an hour Aldrich can use to send reinforcement from Ravenmere. And if we can't break their momentum, then we hold as long as we can and we lose the town. Lyra. She turned to him. The wind caught her dark hair and pulled it across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand in a gesture so ordinary and so human that it reached past every defense Cassian had ever built and touched something underneath that he had forgotten existed. "If we survive this," he said, "I will spend the rest of my life earning back what I destroyed. Don't make promises on rooftops before battles, Cassian. Make them in kitchens after Tuesday dinners when nothing is at stake and no one is watching." The horn sounded from the southern lookout. Drace's vanguard had been spotted, dust and movement on the horizon. The column emerging from the tree line 2 miles south, moving along the river road in a formation that looked, from the rooftop, like a dark river of its own, flowing toward Ashenmere with the patient inevitability of a force that believed its destination was already conquered. Cassian drew his sword. It was the first time he had held a weapon in 3 years. The weight of it was different than he remembered, heavier, more specific. The weight of a tool designed for exactly one purpose, and that purpose was about to become the only language that mattered. Below him, the defenders moved into position, farmers and merchants and militia veterans and the Duke of Blackthorne, standing together behind barricades made from warehouse doors and market stalls, facing an army that outnumbered them 3-1. The column advanced. The distance closed. And in the final moments before the first arrows flew, Cassian Veyne looked at the woman standing beside him on the rooftop and understood that everything he was about to fight for had been standing next to him for 14 years. Invisible, essential, and nearly lost forever because he had been too afraid to look at what he already had. The first wave hit the southern barricade like a fist against stone. The barricade held for 11 minutes. 11 minutes of splintering wood and shouting men and the wet percussion of arrows striking stone walls and wooden shields, and twice human flesh. The defenders at the southern approach fought with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that the space behind them contained everything they owned, every warehouse, every counting house, every market stall where they had spent decades converting labor into livelihood. They were not soldiers. They held their positions the way drowning men hold wreckage, because the alternative was the water. Cassian fought at the center of the line. He had not swung a sword in anger for 3 years, and his body remembered the motion before his mind caught up. The explosive rotation of the hips, the extension through the shoulder, the specific violence of steel meeting resistance. But what his body remembered and what the current moment demanded were different things. He was not leading a disciplined cavalry charge across an open field. He was standing behind a wall of market stalls and warehouse doors, shoulder to shoulder with a grain merchant named Colum, who fought with a repurposed axe handle, and a former militia sergeant named Darren, who carried a sword so old the edge had been reground 3 times. An arrow struck the barricade 6 inches from his face. The impact sprayed splinters across his cheek and left a line of blood that he wiped away with the back of his gauntlet without breaking eye contact with the line of Drace's soldiers reforming for a second push. "They'll flank left." Lyra's voice came from behind and above him, from the rooftop of the central trading hall, where she had positioned herself with 3 runners who carried her orders to every section of the defense. "The alley between the tanner's shop and the river warehouse. It's wide enough for 6 men abreast." "Darren," Cassian shouted, "take 8 men to the tanner's alley. Hold the choke point. Don't let them get width." Darren moved without hesitation. Not because he recognized Cassian's authority as Duke. He moved because a man standing in the same line, bleeding from the same splinters, fighting with the same desperation, had given a tactical order that made sense. Authority earned in real time. Worth measured in the only currency that mattered when arrows were flying. Competence purchased at the cost of shared risk. The second push came harder. Drace's forward commander had expected an empty town and found a defended one, and the recalibration from occupation to assault took his professional soldiers approximately 10 minutes. When they came again, they came correctly. Shield wall at the front. Archers providing covering fire from elevated positions on the southern road. A flanking element moving exactly where Lyra had predicted, toward the tanner's alley, where Darren's 8 men met them in a space too narrow for numbers to matter and held them through 5 brutal minutes of close-quarters fighting that reduced tactical sophistication to the most primitive equation in human conflict. Stand or fall. Hold or break. They held. The fighting lasted 3 hours. It consumed the morning in a chaos of sound and smoke, and the metallic smell of blood mixing with river water and the acrid bite of burning timber from a warehouse that caught fire when an archer's oil-wrapped arrow overshot the barricade. Cassian moved through it the way you move through a fever, moment by moment, each decision compressed into the space between heartbeats. He took a cut across his left forearm that bled freely and hurt less than it should have because the body, under extreme duress, makes its own calculations about what information the conscious mind can afford to process. He lost 4 defenders. Cullum the grain merchant took an arrow through the thigh and was pulled behind the secondary line by 2 women from the trading hall who had organized a medical station from pharmacy supplies and torn bedsheets. A young farmer from Aldenmore, whose name Cassian never learned, was killed by a sword thrust that came through a gap in the barricade during the 3rd push. 2 others fell during the alley fighting, men whose faces Cassian would carry for the rest of his life, not because he knew them, but because they died defending a town that his policies had nearly destroyed. And their willingness to do so, despite that history, constituted an act of generosity he had done nothing to deserve. The battle turned at noon, not through a dramatic reversal or a brilliant tactical maneuver. It turned because of mathematics. Drace's vanguard was 200 men, and 200 men is sufficient to occupy an undefended town, but insufficient to sustain an assault against a fortified position held by defenders who refused to break. Every hour of fighting cost Drace casualties he had not budgeted for, and time he could not afford. His advance force was designed to secure Ashenmere before the main column arrived, not to conduct a siege, and the main column was still a day south, moving through winter roads that made rapid reinforcement impossible. At 12:30, a horn sounded from the Drace line. 3 short blasts. Withdrawal signal. The soldiers pulled back from the barricades and the alley choke point and reformed on the southern road in a defensive column that was significantly smaller than the one that had approached at dawn. 20 minutes later, a second horn sounded. From the north, from the direction of Ravenmere. Aldrich had sent the cavalry. 40 mounted soldiers bearing the black banner of Blackthorne crested the northern ridge and descended toward Ashenmere at a controlled gallop that looked, from the rooftop where Lyra stood watching, like a dark wave breaking across a white landscape. Commander Voss rode at the front. He had left the castle garrison under the command of his lieutenant and brought every mobile unit he could muster, riding through the night on roads that his scouts had cleared by torchlight. Drace's vanguard, caught between a fortified town and an approaching cavalry force, made the only calculation available. They withdrew south. Not routed. Professional soldiers do not rout. They conducted an organized retreat along the river road, maintaining formation, carrying their wounded, moving with the disciplined efficiency of men who understood that the operation had failed and that further engagement would convert a tactical setback into a strategic catastrophe. Cassian watched them go from the southern barricade. His sword arm was shaking. His left forearm was wrapped in a strip of cloth that was already soaked through with blood. His legs held his weight through some combination of adrenaline and stubbornness that would dissolve within the hour and leave him sitting on the ground unable to stand. But he watched the retreat with an expression that was not triumph and not relief, but something closer to the look a man wears when he survives something that should have killed him and understands that survival is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the debt. The aftermath was quieter than the battle. Lyra came down from the rooftop and moved through the defensive positions with the same systematic thoroughness she had applied to organizing them. She checked the wounded. She spoke to the defenders. She inventoried the damage to the merchant quarter, 3 warehouses with structural compromise, 1 destroyed by fire, the southern barricade reduced to kindling. She did all of this without celebration, without the dramatic emotional release that stories usually assign to the end of combat. She worked because work was the language she spoke, and because the gap between surviving a crisis and rebuilding from one was measured in the hours immediately following, when shock was still providing enough anesthesia to function. Cassian found her in the medical station 2 hours after the withdrawal. She was helping the physician Hale treat Colum's arrow wound, holding the grain merchant's legs steady while Hale extracted the arrowhead with instruments that had seen better years. Colum was conscious, gripping a leather strap between his teeth, producing sounds that were not quite screams and not quite breathing but existed in the territory between where language stops and the body takes over. Cassian knelt beside him and held his other leg. Colum's eyes found the Duke's face through a haze of pain, and something passed between them that did not require words. The grain merchant who had described the tariff damage in a roadside inn 2 weeks ago, and the Duke who had listened without defending himself, were now connected by something older and more durable than politics. They had stood in the same line. They had bled in the same fight. And whatever hierarchy existed between them before this day would continue to exist in title and protocol, but it would never again function the same way in the private architecture of either man's understanding of the other. Hale extracted the arrowhead. Colum's body went rigid and then slack. Lyra applied the dressing while Cassian held pressure. The blood was warm on his hands, real, specific. The blood of a man who had fought for a town that Cassian's policies had been slowly strangling. And the fact that this man was alive was attributable not to the Duke's military brilliance, but to a 60-person defense organized by a woman the Duke had written out of his will. That evening, with the town secured and Voss's cavalry establishing a defensive perimeter on the southern road, Cassian sat alone on the steps of the central trading hall and felt the adrenaline leave his body the way heat leaves metal. Slowly. Then, all at once. His hands began to shake, his vision narrowed. The cut on his forearm, now properly cleaned and stitched by Hale's steady hands, began to throb with a deep, insistent pain that radiated up through his elbow and into his shoulder and settled in the base of his skull like a second heartbeat. He sat on those steps and felt everything he had been refusing to feel for 18 months arrive in sequence. Not the political implications, not the strategic calculations. The human wreckage. The woman he had betrayed. The villages he had neglected. The men who had died today defending something he had nearly given away. The child Seraphine carried. A child conceived inside a conspiracy. A child who would be born into the aftermath of a war fought because its father confused desire with devotion, and its mother confused ambition with survival. Aldrich arrived at Ashenmere the following morning with a full dispatch from Ravenmere. The news was mixed but skewed favorable. Drace's main column had halted its advance upon receiving word of the vanguard's repulsion. The Trade Council had suspended the succession petition pending the submission of counter-evidence, which Lyra's documentation provided in exhaustive detail. And 3 border lords who had been calculating the advantages of supporting Drace had abruptly reversed their positions upon learning that the Duke of Blackthorne had personally defended a merchant town with a militia force, an act so contrary to the behavior they expected from Cassian that it forced a fundamental reassessment of the political landscape. Drace is retreating to Greycliff, Aldrich reported. He'll fortify and wait. He's not finished, but he's lost the initiative. What about the Trade Council? Lyra's documents are devastating. The shell company connections, the fund diversions, the forged succession filings. Every piece traces back to Seraphine's network and Drace's financing. The council will have no choice but to dismiss the petition and open an investigation into the petitioners themselves. And Seraphine? Aldrich paused. The pause contained something complicated. She's cooperating, fully. Once she understood that Drace abandoned the operation after the Ashenmere repulsion, she calculated that cooperation offered better terms than continued resistance. She's provided a complete accounting of the financial network, the political contacts, every piece of the conspiracy. Why? Because she is a survivor, Cassian. That's what you never understood about her. She wasn't loyal to you or to Drace. She was loyal to her own continuation. And right now, cooperation is the path that keeps her alive and relevant. Cassian received this information with the exhausted clarity of a man who has stopped filtering reality through the lens of what he wants it to be. Seraphine had operated according to her nature from the beginning. She had been exactly who she was, and the deception was not in her behavior but in his refusal to see it clearly, because seeing it clearly would have required him to confront the emptiness she was filling. The need that drove him into her orbit was not her creation. It was his. She had simply recognized it the way a locksmith recognizes a lock and fashioned herself into the key. The weeks that followed moved at the slower pace of reconstruction. Drace withdrew behind his borders. The Trade Council investigation proceeded with the institutional thoroughness of a bureaucracy that had been embarrassed by its own exploitation and was now overcompensating with procedural rigor. Seraphine's testimony, combined with Lyra's documentation, produced a body of evidence so comprehensive that 3 merchant houses were dissolved, their assets seized, their principals facing charges that would take years to adjudicate. Lord Heron Drace was formally censured by the Dominion Assembly, and his territorial privileges were suspended pending a review that everyone understood would end in permanent reduction of his holdings. Seraphine herself was exiled, not imprisoned. Cassian made that decision over the objections of Voss and several council members who argued that a trader's appropriate destination was a cell, not a carriage to the border. But Cassian understood something about punishment that his advisors did not. Imprisonment creates martyrs. Exile creates irrelevance. And for a woman whose entire existence was organized around proximity to power, irrelevance was a sentence more devastating than any wall or chain could deliver. She left Blackthorne Dominion on a gray morning in late winter, in a carriage provided by the Duchy, with a modest financial settlement that Lyra had calculated to be sufficient for survival but insufficient for influence. As the carriage passed through the castle gates, Cassian watched from the window of his study and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but lived in the space between them where complicated emotions go when they refuse to simplify themselves into categories. He had been responsible for Seraphine, not for her choices, but for the conditions that made those choices possible. He had opened the door. He had provided the access. He had created the vulnerability that she exploited, and while her exploitation was her own moral burden to carry, the conditions belonged to him. That distinction mattered, not as absolution, but as architecture. Understanding what you built wrong is the first requirement for building something better. Spring arrived gradually, the way real seasons arrive, not in a single dramatic transformation, but in the accumulation of small changes. Snow retreating from the fields in patches, rivers swelling with meltwater, the first green pushing through brown earth with the stubborn, inarticulate persistence of things that survive winter by refusing to accept it as permanent. Ravenmere shed its frozen shell and revealed the stone and timber beneath, and the castle that had seemed impregnable in winter looked, in spring light, more human, worn, real, a structure that bore the marks of the storms it had endured. Cassian reformed the tariff structure in the 3rd week of spring. He did it publicly, in a session of the Duchy Council that included, for the first time in Blackthorne's administrative history, elected representatives from every village and market town in the Western Territories. The session lasted 9 hours. It was contentious, detailed, and deeply uncomfortable for a man accustomed to issuing decrees from the comfort of hierarchical authority. But Cassian sat through all 9 hours and listened to every speaker and revised the draft 7 times before the final version received approval. The bridge at Thornfield was rebuilt in April. Medical supply allocations were restored to their original distribution in May. The territorial militia was re-established on a voluntary basis, funded not from the military budget, but from a new levy on the trade revenue that the Coastal Alliance generated, a levy that Lyra designed to scale proportionally so that the wealthiest merchant houses contributed the most without the burden falling on the smaller operators who could least afford it. Lyra did all of this from a position that had fundamentally changed. Not in title. She was still the Duchess of Blackthorne, but in function. She was no longer invisible. Cassian had formally acknowledged her role in the Duchy's financial and diplomatic operations by appointing her co-signatory on all major policy decisions, a legal designation that meant no significant action could be taken by the Duke without her explicit approval. It was, in the language of governance, a power-sharing arrangement. In the language of a marriage, it was a man finally admitting what had been true for 14 years. She was not his support. She was his equal, and treating her as anything less had nearly cost them both everything. But the public reformation was the easier part. The private one happened slowly, painfully, in the spaces between policy sessions and council meetings, and the relentless daily machinery of running a dominion that was still healing from wounds both external and self-inflicted. It happened in the East Wing, in the chambers that Lyra had emptied the night she left, which she had returned to but not fully re-inhabited. Her books were back on the shelves. Her documents covered the writing desk. But the room held a quality of provisionality, the atmosphere of a space occupied by someone who had not yet decided whether she was staying. Cassian came to her chamber on a Tuesday evening in late spring, not with ceremony or agenda. He knocked. She opened the door. He was carrying 2 cups of tea that he had made himself in the kitchen, badly, because he had never made tea in his life, and the result was slightly too strong and slightly too hot, and served in mismatched cups that he had selected from a shelf without understanding that households organized their crockery by set and occasion. "I don't know which cups to use," he said. Lyra looked at the cups, looked at him. Something moved across her face that was too complex for a single name. It contained humor and sadness and exhaustion and the faintest, most cautious edge of something that might, under different lighting, be called warmth. "Those are the breakfast cups." "Is that wrong?" "It's not wrong. It's just not what anyone would choose." "I don't know what anyone would choose. That's the problem. I've spent 41 years having someone else handle every domestic detail of my existence, and I'm standing in front of you with the wrong cups because I genuinely do not know how my own household works." She took the cup. She held it in both hands and looked at the tea inside it, this imperfect, slightly too strong, slightly too hot offering made by a man who had controlled armies and trade routes and political alliances, but had never learned which cups matched which meal. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat in the chair by the window, the chair that visitors used, not the chair beside the bed that belonged to a husband. That distinction was his choice, not hers, and she noticed it and understood what it meant. He was not assuming access. He was requesting proximity. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between the man who had written the will and the man sitting in a room with the wrong cups. They talked. Not about the duchy or the conspiracy or the reconstruction or any of the large structural matters that filled their professional interactions. They talked about small things, the tea, the weather. A bird that had built a nest outside the east wing window during the weeks Lyra was away and was now raising 3 chicks that made noise at dawn. They talked about the kitchen garden that Lyra had planted in their first year of marriage and that had been paved over during the south wing renovation. Cassian offered to restore it. Lyra said she would think about it. The offer and the deferral and the space between them were all part of the same slow, careful, tentative process of 2 people learning to occupy the same life again without the assumptions that had nearly destroyed it. "I'm not going to tell you I forgive you," Lyra said near the end of the evening. "Not because I don't want to, but because forgiveness isn't a single act. It's not a document you sign. It's a direction you move in, and some days the distance closes and some days it opens again, and the only honest thing I can tell you is that I am moving in that direction more often than I am moving away from it." Cassian held his cup. The tea had gone cold. The light in the room was the deep amber of late spring evening, the kind of light that softens edges and makes imperfect things look warmer than they are. And he was grateful for it because what he was about to say required the kind of softness he had spent his entire life refusing. "I spent 41 years believing that strength meant never needing anything I couldn't control. And then I lost the one thing I needed most and discovered that I had never controlled it. I had just been lucky enough to be near it." "That is dangerously close to poetry, Cassian. I know, don't get used to it." She almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles of her face began the motion and stopped short, which was its own form of honesty. A full smile would have been premature. The almost smile acknowledged the direction without pretending the distance had been closed. He left her chamber that night and walked through the east wing corridor to the west tower, where his study waited with its maps and dispatches and the operational machinery of a dominion that was slowly, unevenly, painfully learning to function differently. He walked past the window where he had stood the night Lyra disappeared, the window where he had looked out at a snow-covered empire and believed he owned everything worth owning. The same landscape lay outside, transformed by spring into something greener and less absolute, and the man looking at it was transformed too, though the transformation was not complete and might never be. Some damage is permanent. Some trust, once broken, heals with scar tissue that is stronger than the original but never quite the same in texture. He stood at the window and pressed his palm against the glass the way Lyra had pressed hers the night she left. The temperature differential was smaller now. Spring warmth on both sides. The gap between inside and outside narrower than it had been in winter. Narrower, but still present, still measurable, still the space where the work remained. In the garden below, barely visible in the fading light, a small square of earth had been freshly turned. Dark soil exposed. Ready for planting. Lyra's kitchen garden returned to its original location. She had not asked him to restore it. He had done it that morning with his own hands, badly, because he had never turned soil in his life, and the result was uneven and too shallow in places, and would need to be redone properly before anything could actually grow. But the ground was open, and that, for a man who had spent his entire life building walls, was the closest thing to a beginning he knew how to make. The duchy endured, not through fear, not through the concentrated force of a single man's will imposed on a territory that existed to serve his ambition. It endured because the people who lived inside its borders had been given a reason to invest in its survival that went beyond obedience. It endured because a duchess who had been erased from a will chose to fight for the thing that erased her, not out of loyalty to a man, but out of commitment to the thousands of lives that depended on the structure she had built. And it endured because a duke who had confused possession with partnership learned, at the cost of nearly everything, that the most dangerous enemy is never the one outside the walls. It is the one you build inside yourself. And the hardest battle any man will ever fight is not the one that requires a sword. It is the one that requires him to put it down.